Welcome, Screen Junkies. I'm Roth Cornet, and I am joined, as always, by my partner in crime, Mr. Billy Business.
Yeah, we've got a couple news stories today that all kind of tie into to some major mega theories that we have.
Mega theories for mega minds
theories.
like yours. So setting the stage a little bit, if you guys have tuned into us, you know that we've been talking quite a little bit about a number of things. One is the big streaming wars between Amazon, Netflix, now Apple's entering the game. Another thing that we've been talking about quite a little bit is the Fox-Disney merger and the idea of Hollywood developing into super studios. But you know what we've discovered in the sleuthing that Billy has done this week into some stories is that we have had our eye on the wrong prize, ladies and gentlemen. We really have, because the actual thing in play here has to do with mega conglomerations. It has to do with telecom, Silicon Valley. And you know what hangs in the balance that you care about, believe me you do, is net neutrality. So that's already in the balance, but let's break it down for you. Some unrelated seeming things actually tell quite the story about Hollywood, starting with the Warner Brothers. So Warner Brothers, you guys probably know this, Time Warner is in negotiations to merge with AT&T.
Right.
There is a case that is coming up in March, which will decide the fate of this merger. If it does not go through, they may actually sell off separately. They may sell HBO here, Warner Brothers there. It leaves DC a little bit in the balance, which means first we'll say what happens if that does happen, where could DC go? But then let's talk about what happens if the merger does go through.
Right. So basically, you just saw the graph right there. There's a lot of components there to the Time Warner thing. Right now, this is being held up by the Department of Justice, who is checking to see if there's any antitrusts, any monopolies to make sure that this passes muster. What could happen if the DOJ says, no go, this is too big, is that we could potentially see HBO, Warner Brothers being picked up by somebody, and then DC Comics. Now, it's not a lock that DC wouldn't go along with the package with something else, but theoretically, DC could end up who knows where.
Yes.
A lot of people are like, Disney. I don't think Disney would be interested in DC. I think they have too many of their own properties. And I think that from a publishing standpoint, it just doesn't make sense for them business-wise to want to pick up DC.
It's a little, and we've been talking about this as well with Disney. There definitely is a Disney brand, right? Now, they certainly have properties and films that go off that brand to some degree. But when they're looking at launching the streaming service, and it's a streaming service that's going to be pretty exclusively family friendly and on Disney brand. Does DC or does DC not fit into that? Who knows? But they're having such great success with Marvel. They are, ostensibly speaking, going to have the characters from Fox, the Marvel characters from Fox. They have a lot on their plate.
Right.
They have Star Wars. So taking on DC and figuring out that pickle, that conundrum, seems unlikely. But what seems possible is Apple, who is considering purchasing Time Warner as well. Apple is now launching their own streaming service. Could they just pick up all of Warner Brothers? Could they just pick up DC?
This is interesting, too, because Apple, as we've talked about on other videos, Apple has enough money to buy most of these companies 3 or 4 times over. Apple now getting into this content war, I guess, that you want to call it. It's interesting because I could see them wanting to have the DC license in terms of like their characters for content wise, but you can't forget about that publishing side, and that's definitely not something that I think Apple is interested in at all. I think if you buy DC Comics, you're not only buying the screen rights, but you're also buying the publishing business, and I don't think that Apple would really want to take that on. It's not in their wheelhouse.
It's not in their wheelhouse, and also seemingly like what Apple is interested, not unlike Amazon, is yes, doing original content, but it's also largely to boost their other revenue streams, right? And so Apple wants to sell Apple devices, and Apple wants to sell you an Apple TV. Is it possible that they just pick up the entire Warner Brothers library? Maybe. They financially could. But it'd be interesting to see, the DOJ, as you mentioned, filed this antitrust case against the AT&T Time Warner merger, where the lines between monopoly begin and end. I'm a little unclear of. I think the government, this is I don't know what the government is or is not thinking, but It feels like they are too, you know?
Well, this is something that they thought AT&T, I think, and Time Warner thought this was going to be a
It'd
slam
be easy,
dunk.
yeah.
It turned out not to be the case. But in terms of, I was just thinking while you were speaking, I don't know how messy they would want if this doesn't go through. I don't know how messy things could potentially get in terms of, do you split DC up? Do you do like what Marvel did in the 90s when they were facing bankruptcy, where someone takes on the publishing and then they sell those movie rights to another studio and then it becomes a big mess? We've seen with MGM when they were facing problems, if you want to buy a James Bond movie, it's Sony that's releasing it on Blu-ray or another company, so they could sell off their catalog, they could, but not their current production rights. Like, this could really get messy really quick if this doesn't go through. But I think a lot of people are watching this, not us, but a lot of people in telecoms and Facebooks and Apples, they don't care about Disney Fox. This is the one that they're looking at.
This is the one that they're looking at. In a way, this is the one that we should be looking at as we talk about the idea of mega studios and these big conglomerations and mergers, because the truth is, what do all of these companies have in common? They're not for net neutrality. And what direction are we headed towards right now? Let's face it. Yes, people are still going to go to the theaters, but we are more and more and more going to be getting our entertainment on streaming. I do not believe that the studios aren't banking on that. I do not believe that any of these companies are not banking on that. And if let's play that out. Let's just play that out. Where these,
sure,
yeah,
well,
AT&T has control of all this content.
Well, I want to be clear. AT&T, as much as I think even a month ago, kind of was like, hey, we're for net neutrality. Like, sure, there have been some, even when the net neutrality was voted down a couple months back, there were some of these telecom companies that were like, hey, we're for it. And but not really. If you look at the fine print, they're like, well, we're not for what's there right now, but in general, sure. And then there's your Verizons. There's some of your other companies that are just like, no good. That's net neutrality, bad.
Yeah, and so what happens if the people that have the switch on the content are, right? So what happens to us, the consumer? Let's play that out. Potentially.
This is all theoretical. This is all potential, but I think that's the point of why we should be looking at this case, because this is theoretically, potentially what we're looking at. I think if you're looking at something where, let's say, perfect example, and I don't want to screw up your thing here, but
screw up my thing.
Lionsgate.
Yeah,
let's talk about Lionsgate real quick, because I feel like this ties into something like this. Lionsgate is a company that has built itself on acquiring other content. They have now gotten to the point where they've acquired so much content that they're like, we feel like we are a viable enough brand for someone else to pick up. The last couple months, we've been thinking, what studio is going to swallow each other? Is Universal going to swallow Paramount? Is Paramount going to swallow Warner Brothers?
Well, Paramount's probably not going to swallow anything at this point.
Paramount's going to swallow something. We don't know what it is. But the point being, we've been thinking in terms of studios.
Yeah.
What we should be thinking of, and especially going back to that last case, is what company could potentially pick up Lionsgate. And that's where one of the suitors that they were talking about, Lionsgate could easily be bought by a Facebook, by a Google, by an Apple, or by some names that you wouldn't normally consider, a Verizon, or a T-Mobile. Like, there are other big telecoms now that want to own that content, because if you own the content and you own the keys to get to that content, there's no one to stop you.
There's no one to stop you, and you can basically continue to have additional revenue streams by charging us more money just to be able to stream the content that we're trying to stream. And that is the danger of this, the potential danger. We're not saying this is going to happen. We're saying this is sort of like, as the landscape shifts and moves, what a studio is or is not is being entirely rewritten in front of our eyes. So let's talk about what Lionsgate does own, which, again, Lionsgate is currently up for sale. And this is what they own: Hunger Games, Power Rangers, Twilight, The Expendables, Now You See Me, Medea, Saw, Blair Witch, Step Up, and a TV library that includes Weeds, Mad Men, South Park, Nashville, Nurse Jackie, Party Down, oh, such a fun show, Spartacus, and Ash versus the Evil Dead. So There are a number of things that somebody that already has, I don't think that this is a library that kind of like gets you everything.
Sure.
But if you add this to an existing library,
Correct.
if you're an Amazon, there's a lot that you can do. Maybe you're making a Hunger Games TV series at that point.
Well, let's take this hypothetical since we're already on this train, but let's take it to its fullest potential.
Get on the
let's say
tinfoil hat train.
Let's say that this merger of AT&T and Time Warner goes through. Now the telecoms are like, doors wide open.
Yeah.
Let's say Verizon comes in and buys Lionsgate. They say, hey, you guys have Hunger Games. Everyone wants a prequel series. Let's do a prequel series about Hunger Games. But guess what? If net neutrality goes away, it's like, well, if you want this, you have to have, you can pay for it. Or if you're a Verizon customer, you can stream it. But if you don't have our mega plan, we can charge you overages on data.
Yes.
But if you do have this mega plan, you can stream the Hunger Games, which is only on Verizon.
Yeah.
Like, that's where the wheels start getting out of control. Do I think that it would be so restrictive that it would be this, like, you know, dystopian kind of entertainment? No, but I think it wouldn't be as simple as it is now.
I know I'm watching a Pan Am prequel series.
Which
I know that
which
much.
I now think, ironically, what a
Right.
what a franchise I chose to use this example.
Exactly.
With, you know?
It's true. Now, would that, if we're being honest as well, there are going to be successes and failures
Sure.
as people launch all of these different, because Verizon's already been trying to do that to some degree, and nobody's buying what they're selling. Nobody wants their content, which puts them in a position to want to go out and buy some content, probably that people do want, because what they invested in so far is not really working out all that well for them, if we're honest.
Sure.
However, if you start looking at some of these other companies piecemealing together studios and content and libraries, then they're going to be in a position to really, really, really wield a lot of power over us as a consumer. Not that I'm scared of technology.
No, and you shouldn't be. I think
I definitely am.
Well, I've heard. Well, here's the thing. I've heard the criticism that sometimes we seem like we're a little resistant to change. It's like, no, I don't think we're resistant. I do think that some of the paths we're on are not the best for us as consumers. But in terms of like, is a streaming war bad? No, competition's great.
It makes the streaming wars and what's happened in television over the last 5 to 10 years in terms of like how diverse the content has been and how competitive it's been has given us a golden age of television.
Yeah.
We have incredible television shows right now, because if you don't, I'm not buying your stuff, right?
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
a good thing.
I you know, they just dropped that Lost in Space trailer on Netflix, which looks like it could be its own $150 million movie. You don't get something like that if we're not in the middle of a life or death for those companies streaming war.
Exactly. But the problem is, once you start getting more and more and more and more consolidated, then what's actually happening is that you're removing competition and you're
Right.
removing the consumer's power to choose. And if I want to choose this thing, we've talked about this with Netflix already. If I want to watch Netflix and my internet provider is making it more expensive for me to watch Netflix because I have to buy the whatever, like, Netflix Happy Face package that's X more dollars a month, that sucks for me as a consumer. That just sucks for me as a consumer. You start to get into huge consolidations, and suddenly that competition goes away, and we're going to get a whole bunch of, I don't know, what's the worst show on television?
That's a loaded question. Probably Big Bang Theory, because I have to watch it with my wife every week.
Well, we'll get nothing but that, but people do like that.
So that's kind of, you know, worst case scenario. There are other scenarios here that they did kind of map out of what could potentially happen to Lionsgate, and I think one of them, which is kind of what you would think nowadays is most likely would happen, is they kind of partner with another studio. So like, let's say Sony. I think Sony's the one that looks attractive right now. Sony is one that has the operations in place that could take on something like Lionsgate, and it kind of makes sense in that aspect where they kind of don't have it 100% together right now at Sony. Sometimes, you know, they've had some hits last year, but it's been a little wishy-washy.
Jumanji's the gift.
Sure, they had Jumanji, and I'm sure that partnership with Marvel with Homecoming becoming helped.
Yeah.
But for the most part, Sony's been struggling a little bit for the last couple of years. So to take on that library for a company like Sony, I feel like makes sense more than like a Disney or Universal.
Yeah, they don't. I mean, I feel like Disney's got so much going on already, and these things aren't necessarily entirely on, like we've been saying, on brand for Disney. Which again, it's not that Disney only does one kind of film. It's just that when it does focus, those films are hits.
Right.
You know what I mean? They just are, and those TV shows are generally hits. Like ABC does nicely for them. They have the Netflix Marvel series. They'll continue to have things that are a little off-brand, but to take on a whole other library right now, who knows? I don't see it happening, but you never really know.
Sony also has a lot of deals in place that licensing this new material that they would acquire would probably be a bit easier for them than some of the other companies. Now, scenario 2 is one that we haven't quite hit on as much yet, but this is where it's a step above studios, below telecoms, which is the Facebooks, the YouTubes, the Googles. They're the ones that are like the tech companies. How do we get into this? I could easily see Facebook, who is really trying to figure out how to really capture this content and make people watch, because you're already on Facebook anyways. I could see a library like Lionsgate being attractive to them.
Yeah, I could, depending, and I think that this really depends on how people are watching Facebook. You know, like if they really can get to the point that people are watching and used to, and can even conceptualize the idea of watching anything that's more than just a smash up meme on Facebook. You know, that they're really going to sit down and watch long form content on Facebook, because I don't know. I think that's like mentally you almost have to overcome the idea of the brand ID at this point, which is so embedded. And once a brand is really defined, it's hard to kind of break out of that. So I'm watching Facebook, and I could be wrong. I don't see that. I don't see that. I really don't. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't buy it in an attempt to make that happen.
Yeah. Also, Facebook has a tendency to kind of try something really hard and then abandon it.
Exactly.
Apple is also another one that could potentially be in the running. I'm not so sure on Apple, just because I feel like their mission has always been, let's put our own stamp on things, make our own things. So to acquire something is not really in Apple's wheelhouse generally. That being said, they've never been in a content creation standpoint before, so it's possible.
And the truth about, when we talk about these like streaming wars and content wars and things like that, you need a lot of it. I mean, that is why you have Netflix spending and spending and spending and spending and spending right now, because they just need a lot of it. And so that's why Disney bought Fox, ostensibly speaking, among other reasons. It's just to get that library. And so for Apple to try and do this from the ground up and not actually buy some libraries seems untenable to me.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. Again, Apple keeps a lot of it close to the chest, so we don't really know what their play is. And as you just said, another home could be Netflix. Look, they show that they'll buy almost anything at this point to get some properties that not only could they get the streaming rights, which I'm sure they've had at one point or another, they could still have to a lot of those shows that we talked about. It could also be potential for them, as we've seen, to either revive a show, spin off a show, do a whole new movie series, especially with Hunger Games, Twilight. I think there's still a market for that stuff, even though those have ended a couple of years ago.
Oh, you know that people would at least tune in to see if that Twilight TV show was any. You know that there are people, plenty of them.
You know you're going to watch it. You know.
You will watch it.
You know.
You know. You will hate watch it.
But you would
You will watch it.
And then lastly, the third scenario, like we've been saying, is kind of the unlikely one. Not unlikely, but unlikely in the terms of that we don't never talk about it, is, yeah, if the DOJ is like, yeah, you can buy Time Warner, what's to stop them from buying Lionsgate? What's to stop T-Mobile, who also, we've seen T-Mobile partner with Netflix, and I could easily see some sort of partnership between the three of them for a library like that. Or there's also Verizon. I definitely think a telecom could be kind of the dark horse. But again, like I've been saying, it all depends on what happens on that AT&T Time Warner merger.
100%. The other final piece of this puzzle for our wild tinfoil hat theories is Comcast is interested in buying Sky. Now, this doesn't come as a huge surprise. Sky is, of course, part of Fox. So Sky has international value for Comcast. And that was largely what they were interested in when they were vying for Fox in the first place. So it's not hugely surprising to hear this, but it is another case example of a big conglomeration.
Yeah, I think, again, we talk a lot about, is Wolverine going to be in Avengers? It's like, well, I think Disney's thinking like, well, can we get the rights to like English Premier League, which they have over in Sky? I think international presence, as we've seen, watch any episode of Charting with Dan and you'll figure out real fast, our domestic box office, our domestic receipts, they're kind of just a small piece of the pie. And I think Disney wants to get that stronghold, especially when Sky has a lot of sports contracts over there. And ESPN has been hurting a little bit of the ratings domestically. But if you can get an international foothold on international sports, international news, and you own all that,
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's another market that's not really sexy to us. But to Disney, that's way more important than getting the Fantastic Four.
Yeah, getting that football.
Getting that like football, but like real football.
But real football.
With your feet.
With the feet. Soccer.
The feet ball.
Feet ball. Yeah. Absolutely. And sports is something that we haven't even addressed a ton when we've been talking about this, largely because I don't watch them. But it is a massive piece of the pie. It's a massive piece of the puzzle when it comes to entertainment and certainly entertainment spending and what Disney would want. And they've got ESPN at this point.
Well, this is an interesting number, especially as it relates to Comcast, which has a huge cable subscriber base. But Sky right now has 23 million subscribers across Europe. In the United States, Comcast has 29 million. So you immediately increase your customer base by 80% just by getting Sky. That's insane for any company. Of course, that's exactly what they're going to want to do. It just takes a lot of balls to undercut Disney and anything right now.
Yeah, it does. And we'll see what happens because this, the Fox Disney merger is still TBD. That has not gone through yet.
Right.
We will certainly know in March about the landscape, a little bit more about the landscape when it is decided whether AT&T can or cannot buy Time Warner, and we'll update you then for sure on where things are headed or where we imagine they may be headed. But a lot rests in the balance of the things that are happening outside of the general entertainment news coverage. Of course, we're eyeing Fox and Disney. That is a sexy looking deal, but it's also kind of, the ornament on the Christmas tree that's hiding Krampus.
I actually got that. I understand. I don't know if I've just been around you too long.
Me.
I understood that metaphor completely. I think really the takeaway from this whole thing is, we've been talking about the streaming wars for a really long time now. And I feel like our viewers, I feel like all of us have been pretty well educated. But I think we've been neglecting the power players are not necessarily the studios. It's the telecoms. It's the tech companies. And I think those are the ones that we got to watch because, ultimately we just want to know, what is our content going to look like, and where is it going to come from, and how am I going to be able to get it? And I think
and how much is it going to cost me?
And how much is it going to cost me?
That's the real key.
And if the telecoms are kind of getting in this race and they kind of acquire a lot, guess what? You cord cutters.
Yeah.
Cable's coming back just in a whole new different book cover.
And the truth is, cable probably is coming back in a whole new different book cover. It is the same thing all over again. In a slightly different way. It's very different players and players that have a power that cable didn't, in that they impact our whole lives.
You point to your computer.
They all rest.
This is our lives.
This is our lives. It all rests in the internet. And if you're talking about all of that going into a few hands, that's not a scenario I love.
No, it's not. But at the same time, I think also this has the potential to be something really great and something really cool. And I like that it gives an opportunity for other properties to kind of it's now's a time where there's almost no such thing as niche anymore. Everything is, and you can find it somewhere. And hopefully that's the way that everything pans out is, man, you're a DC fan. Guess what? DC's got streaming. You're a fan of this. There's streaming for that. I think that's a good thing, and hopefully that's the way it stays.
Well, we'll see how it all pans out in Panem. Thank you for joining us today. I will leave you with that terrible pun. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Is this a situation that you have optimism about, that you have concerns about? A little bit of both? little good, a little bad, something in between. Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you next time on Screen Junkies News.